And we've been on this topic of how to love like Jesus for 7 weeks now. We're in the final week. And we've looked at love in some of its most complex forms. One of the most complex forms is putting boundaries around love, learning to say no to those who you love. Maybe even more risky and more complex is the form of love, which is confrontation, actually having to take the risk to confront somebody you love, to be honest with them, knowing that often confrontation doesn't work out how we would hope, but sometimes love requires it. But love is also simple, and as we conclude this series on how to love like Jesus, I don't want us to miss the most simple and basic forms of love, because when we practice those forms of love, these basic forms of love that we're going to talk about today, they set up opportunities to love one another and be loved in the way that Jesus loved us. Now, each week I've been starting off with this scripture, and this is the last time you'll see it, so I thought maybe we'll read it together. This is a statement that Jesus made on his last night with his disciples, where he defines what it means to be his follower. So if you'll read along with me, as I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. Now, if you are a disciple of Jesus Christ, this is incredibly important because Jesus defines this whole Christian thing, this whole religion thing around our capacity to love like he loved. And if you're not a disciple, if you're here for other reasons, or you're curious and you're just checking this out, this is important for you too, because what we've been doing throughout this series is simply looking at a model of how to love. We've all experienced models for how to love, some good, some bad. And Jesus says, hey, take a look at my model of how to love one another, and I promise you, things will go well, better than they could have. So today we're going to look at the basic forms of love, and it's summed up in this acronym PAL, which is why I had to do that goofy thing with the PAL. And PAL simply stands for presence, attention, and listening. These are the basic forms of love, and one leads into the next. So let's talk about presence. There's a story about a man who worked a 9-to-5 job, and he was a father and he's a husband. And one day after work, he stops in at his local tavern for a drink. And then he begins a practice of stopping in after work each night for a drink, and that one drink becomes 2 drinks, and that 2 drinks becomes 3. And after a while, he's drinking 3 or 4 drinks every night after work, 5 days a week. And those that are near this man, that knew this man, they know that after about the 3rd drink, that's when the talk about how much he loves his beautiful wife and how wonderful his kids are begins to come out. And after drink 4 or 5, the tears start to flow as this man pours out his heart about how much he loves his family, only to come home one night and his wife has left him and taken the kids. Because words about love aren't actually the practice of love. And we can talk about how we love one another, but if you're never present with one another, if you never show that love, is it really love? Here's what John has to say about it. It says, dear children, let's not merely say that we love each other. Let us show the truth by our actions. We can say that I love you. We can talk about our feelings of love, but do we really engage in the Jesus kind of love, being present with one another through the actions? Now, one of the central ideas in the Christian gospel is this idea of Emmanuel, God is with us. In fact, when Matthew begins his story about who Jesus is and the significance of it to us, he references this Old Testament prophecy, and he refers to Jesus as Emmanuel. That in Jesus, God comes among us, that God's first act is simply to be present with us, to walk the footsteps that we would walk, to share in relationships how we share, to be tempted, to suffer, to be present. Presence can make all the difference. Before I came here, I was a chaplain at Methodist Hospital and Riley Hospital, and one of the things that I often did was attend to the emergency room. And one night a woman came in to the emergency room, and she didn't live long. She passed away after a short amount of time. And it was my role to call the person who was the contact, the next family member, somebody like that. And the person I got a hold of was her nephew. And this man comes in about an hour later, and he doesn't know that his aunt had passed away. And I greet him at the door, and I bring him to the quiet room, which is where you're taken in a hospital if something serious is going on with one of your family members. And shortly after that, the attending physician came in, and it was that person's role as the medical professional to give the medical diagnosis that the person was deceased. And this young doctor, I'd worked with him before. He had a big heart. He was very skilled at the techniques that heal people, and he delivered the news to this nephew, who was more like a brother or a best friend, I would later find out. And the nephew erupts in emotion and throws himself on this table, the small little table that's in the quiet room, almost breaking it in two. And now he's on the floor, and the physician gets up out of his chair, used to fixing things, and goes over and tries unsuccessfully to get the man back to the comforts of the couch. And he looks over at me, the so-called specialist when it comes to grief, and I'm sitting there, not moving. And he kind of looks at me like, aren't you going to do something? And I say, nope. And he tries again to do something with this man who's overcome with his grief. And he's trying to fix the situation, but it's an unfixable situation. There's no taking away this man's pain. And the physician looks at me again, and I mouth to him, I got this. And he looks, thank you. And he leaves. And I sit. And I sit. Because presence can make a big difference. Sometimes all you can do with somebody, the most loving thing to do is just to hang in there with them, not try to fix the situation because it's unfixable. Just stay present. But presence, of course, is not sometimes sufficient enough. It also requires attention. This is a familiar scene, unfortunately, these days. In fact, I'm working with a couple of young couples who are preparing to get married. And I asked the soon-to-be wife, I said, what is a way in which your soon-to-be husband can practically show his love for you? And she was quick with the answer, put away his phone at the dinner table. It's important to be present, but one must pay attention. Back to that emergency room scenario where I'm there with the man and he's on the ground grieving and he's overwhelmed with emotion. I'm just doing my best to stay present, but I, didn't pull out my phone and check my fantasy football scores. I stayed paying attention. And because I was paying attention, and the times when you're being present and paying attention, it allow you to know when it is time to make the next step. And after a while, the floods of his emotion began to subside. And it was then that I went over and helped him back to the couch. And then we sat in silence for a while longer. And then he began to talk, and I started to listen. And eventually, far later than I would have expected when I first got started in that ministry, I prayed with the man. Paying attention is critical. Being present is the start, but you must pay attention. And the next level is to really, really listen to people. Give your attention to what God is doing right now, Jesus says to us and teaches. Sometimes we're in that moment and we think we're listening and we think we're connecting, but our mind is going all these other places and we're 5 steps ahead of the moment. And what Jesus is trying to teach us to do, if you want to love like he loved, be present with the person, but be fully attending to the moment and look for what God might be doing. Slow it down. Keep your attention and see what God might be doing. I've been drawn on the work of M. Scott Peck throughout this series, that the definition that I've referenced several times for love. Love is defined as the extension of oneself for the purpose of nurturing spiritual growth. That comes from M. Scott Peck. And so does this quote, which I think is really powerful. He says, you cannot truly listen to anyone and do anything else at the same time. Oh, I'm great at multitasking. Sure you are. When you look at the way that Jesus practices love, and when we really think about love, to really listen to somebody is a unique thing. It's a powerful thing. It's a thing that is often not really practiced. I'm not just talking about hearing their words. I'm talking about listening to them, feeling their emotion, paying attention to the tone, to the body language, and looking deeper to the meaning that is behind what is being communicated. Be present, pay attention to the person, and then listen, truly listen, beyond just words, through the emotion to the meaning of what they're trying to communicate. Now, listening is difficult, and there's a lot of ways to be a bad listener. Here are three. You can be a squirrel, you can be a spotlight, or you can be a reloader. Okay, these are three. There's many more that we could come up with, but I think these are kind of fun. And the squirrel is somebody who gets easily distracted. And I have a wonderful little 15-second clip. And I got to tell you that in some regards, this clip doesn't work because the person who demonstrates what it means to be a squirrel is actually doing the talking. But you'll see the individual, which actually is a dog, gets easily distracted in this scene. And I think it really captures what it means to be a squirrel. So here you go.
Did that dog just say hi there?
Oh, yes.
Bruh!
My name is Doug. I have just met you, and I love you. My master made me this collar. He is a good and smart master, and he made me this collar so that I may talk. Squirrel!
So first of all, I just got to comment on the fact that he's a dog. It's like, I just met you and I love you, which is great for dogs, right? But this is it, right? And you've probably met people who are squirrels. I got somebody in my family who's a definition of a squirrel. And this individual does a great job at the initial greeting and makes you feel like that they really want to hear what you have to say. And so you're like, okay, this is not a person just saying, hey, how you doing? And it's that general exchange. Like, it feels like they really want to know. And I think that they do, but the minute you really get into it, something catches this person's attention and they're on to the next thing. You ever been with this person? Maybe you are this person. It's just like, you see something, it reminds you of something, you have a thought, and before you know it, you disconnect. This is the squirrel. They're impulsive, easily distracted by just about anything. Now, here's a spotlight. Some of you might remember this moment. This is Taylor Swift, and she had just won the Best Music Video of the Year award. And Kanye West, who was in the crowd at this point in time, had no reason to be on stage. Something about that moment triggered a thought, an opinion that Kanye had, and he decided to get out of his seat, go up on the stage, pull the mic out of Taylor's hand, and steal the spotlight and tell the whole world that he thought, although her video was good, that Beyonce had the best video of the year. Now, he is the most extreme example of a spotlight, but I tell you, friends, I've learned through some of my colleagues that have helped me see this about myself, I'm a bit of a spotlighter. And here's how it works. You'll be talking to me about something, so sorry if I've done this to you, but you'll be talking to me about something, and I genuinely, honest to God, I want to connect with you. I want to connect with people. It's one of my personal missions. But something you say will trigger something important to me, and I'll be like, oh yeah, I've been there. And then I start telling you this whole story about my life and what's important to me, and I've just stolen the spotlight from you. Y'all ever experienced that? Maybe not from me. You don't have to raise your hand if it's me, right? But you know what I'm talking about? And we do this. And I think our intentions, unlike Kanye's, I don't want to speak about his, but I think our intentions are well put. We're trying to connect. And it's not that we're squirrels or we're just anything, but it's when we have something that's important, we want to share it, and we can't wait. Now, the final type of bad listener is the reloader. And the reloader doesn't even really care what you have to say. The reloader is the person that gets their, says what they want to say, and then it's your turn to talk, and they're not even really listening. They're just kind of reloading their points, ready to fire them at you. And it's not about really connecting. It's just, I want to be heard. I want my perspective. I don't really care what you have to say. Some people are reloaders, or perhaps, friends, we can all realize that each and every one of us, we fall victim to these types of bad listening. Right? Here's what the Bible calls a reloader. It has a name for them. It says fools. Reloaders are fools. Fools have no interest in understanding. They only want to air their opinions. Last week, we talked about spiritual growth, and a spiritually mature person is somebody who is inward directed and outward focused. The more you mature, the more you care to learn about others. The fool is a spiritually immature individual, only cares about airing their own opinions. Intelligent people, on the other hand, are always ready to learn. Their ears are open for knowledge. The first sign that somebody maybe is leaning towards the fool category is when they say, hey, I already know that. You can't tell me anything new. I got it all figured out. That's like fool language. Intelligent people are the ones saying, hey, tell me more. I need to learn. Some of the most intelligent people that I've been around, the thing that they knew was how much they didn't know. And so it made them great listeners. The thing that they knew was how much they didn't know. The more you learn about this world, the more mystery you begin to see. And it's important that we become intelligent people as listeners, because listening can make a big difference. Here's one more quote from Proverbs. It says, the purposes of a person's heart are deep waters, but one who has insight draws them out. The purposes of a person's heart are deep waters, that in you and in me, my purposes are in there deep. Who I am, what it means to be me, my reflection of God's divinity in this world, they're deep, but they can be drawn out by people who have insight. How do you gain insight? You're present, you're paying attention, and you're really, truly listening. Now, I want to take you to a story from the life of Jesus to conclude the sermon. And this is the story of the woman at the well, and it's from John, the fourth of the four Gospels. And the thing to know about John is that it was written much later than the first three Gospels. And there's stories in John that you don't find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which tells me that John is probably somewhat aware of the way that the Jesus story is being told. And he's thinking to himself, you know what? I have a few more stories that you need to hear. If you really want to know who this Jesus was, there's a couple more stories that get to the essence of who this man was and what he was communicating about God. This story we're about to look at is one of those stories only included in the Gospel of John. It starts off this way. Jesus, worn out by the trip, sat down at the well. It was noon. So Jesus and his disciples are traveling. And Jesus, because he's a human being like the rest of us, he's worn out. He's been traveling, he's been preaching, he's been attending to people. And so he sits down at this well, which we're going to later find out is called Jacob's Well, which is significant because it ties the scene that we're about to look at back to the history of the Jewish people. And he sits down at it and he sends his disciples off to get some food. And the fact that it's at noon is really important for what happens next. Because Jesus is sitting there and then this woman starts to approach. And I think it's believable to think that Jesus might have been to this area before. I mean, he's in his 30s. He clearly had traveled some before. And so it's also possible, because these are small communities, that he had heard some of the rumor mill that happens in small communities, right? I mean, you've been in some small communities, and it didn't take long to hear the most juicy rumors that are happening in the area. And so this woman starts approaching at noon, which is a trigger for Jesus to connect it to the specific person. I'm just imagining this. This might be how it happened. But he looks at her because there's this woman in the community that is well known because she's had 5 husbands. And we don't know why she's had 5 husbands. We don't know if all 5 of them passed away and it's been really tragic, or maybe they divorced her. But what we do know from the cultural context is that if you had 5 husbands, you would have been looked at as a curse, as a failure. The blame would have been put on you. And so the reason that she's coming at noon is because all the other women from the town come in the morning time, in the late evening when it was cool, when it's reasonable to go get water. And the fact that she's coming alone is seen as a deliberate attempt to avoid all those other people in her community that have been judging her, looking down their nose at her, and telling her that she's a curse. Those 5 husbands in some regard are her fault, and conveniently pointing out the fact that she's living with another man who she's not even married with. So here she comes, and she approaches, hoping nobody's going to be there. And instead, it's the worst person possible to be there is a Jewish rabbi. Now, for that to make sense to you, you need to understand just a little bit of the history, and I could go deeper into this, but let me give you a sketch. There was a single kingdom at one point in time under King David, and then under his grandson, it splits into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom, with Jerusalem in the south. And in 722, the Assyrians take over the northern kingdom, and they take all the educated people, all the young people, all the strong people out of the community and bring new people in, and they begin to intermarry. And so the pure Israelite race begins to be blended with some outsiders. Later, the southern kingdom is also taken over, and they're taken out of the area, but then they get to come back. A remnant of them come back, still pure, not intermarried, and they try and begin to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. You can read about it in the book of Nehemiah and Ezra. And during this period, the now called Samaritans, who are up in the north, they start to try to stop the Israelites who are rebuilding Jerusalem. And this, enemies begin to be formed between the two. And the Jewish people, the people in the south, they claim, hey, we're pure, we've always had the religion, and they begin to really look down their noses at all the Samaritans. So if you read the Gospels, often the Samaritans would come up, and you got to think to yourself, that's like Patriots fans or something like that in our context. It's like the worst you can think about, right? And so this is important because Jesus is there and she shows up, right? She's trying to avoid all human contact and she's avoiding her community. And here's this rabbi, and just clearly he's going to look down his nose at her. And so I'm trying to avoid judgment, and here I come with a whole other slew of judgment. Could my day get any worse? And Jesus asks for a drink, and the Samaritan woman, she's taken aback. How come you, a Jew, are asking me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink? You Jews, you think you're the pure, unadulterated, people of God, and you have this whole thing about ceremonially clean, you won't eat with people, all this sort of stuff. Like, she is just taken aback. And this amazing conversation unfolds. And Jesus, he listens to her, he listens beyond what she has to say, and he goes to the meaning, and he identifies and empathizes with her hurt. But she, having her walls up, she continually tries to keep him at an arm's length, using mostly sarcasm. If you go back and read this dialogue sometime, read it through the lens of sarcasm that she's using. And she's trying to keep Jesus away, but he keeps staying present, paying attention, listening, and identifying the issues, that she's judged by her community because of the deal with her husbands, and that she feels judged by him as a religious person, and she doesn't feel like she's accepted anywhere. And he says this after listening a long time and hanging in there. He says, but the time will come, and it has in fact come, when what you're called will not matter, and where you go to worship will not matter. Or what you're called, because she's been called names because of what has happened in her love life and personal life. And where you go to worship, which is important because there's this rival idea of worship. And she's probably thinking, hey, this whole thing about having to go to this place to meet God in the first place doesn't seem to be serving me well. And Jesus is saying, this sort of stuff, which isn't working for you, which is creating harm for you, this is coming to an end. However, this is the kind of people the Father is looking for. Those who are simply and honestly themselves before him in their worship. A woman who's been hurt by her community. A woman who's been hurt by the religious establishments of her day is told that God knows you and accepts you just as you are. All he wants is for you to simply and honestly be yourself. That's where this starts. And it goes straight to the heart of the matter. Because when you practice patience or presence, attention, and really listen It creates an opportunity for empathy, for you to feel what the other person is feeling. And so then when you dare to speak, your words are being spoken not to a person, but with them, feeling their pain. And this makes a big difference in her life. Because she goes back to the very community that she's been trying to avoid, and she starts telling them all about this interaction with Jesus. In fact, this is what she says. He knew all about the things I did, my 5 husbands and the man that I'm living with, and he knows me inside and out. And he still loved me. Jesus comes and meets some of the other Samaritans, right? The rivals, the bad people, this whole thing. And he begins to listen to them. He begins to attend to them, be present with them. And they ask him to stay 2 days. And he does. And the gospel writer says that a big number of them, a lot of them, decided to entrust their lives to Jesus. Which brings us to the point that I want us to land on and finish with in this sermon series, which is known people entrust their lives to people. And when you really love somebody and you're present and you're paying attention and you're listening beyond the words, but you're trying to understand the deeper purposes of their hearts, who they are, that when people really feel known and accepted, they will entrust their lives to you. Works in marriages. Our hearts gravitate to places where we're accepted. If you feel known and loved, you'll entrust yourself to your loved one. It works in friendships. It works in churches. We've talked about here wanting to connect with young people and children, not because they're better than anybody, but because a church needs a whole group of old people, middle-aged people, and young people. But it just so happens to be the fact that most churches like ours are missing young people, so we're focused on developing relationships with our young folk. And my little girl, Sophie, she provides an example of what I hope to have for every one of our young people from age 1 year on all the way up to 25, 30, whatever you want to name it. Sophie comes around here, you all know her. You call her by name. She went to Disney and like half a dozen people or maybe 24 people asked her about it. And she walks around here with this knowledge of God's love because she's known and accepted and people take delight in her. Thank you, community, for that. You don't know what that means. But I want that for all of our kids. And so how is it that we can know our kids and our young people? We got an idea that is taking fold today. I'm asking parents to give us permission to take a picture of your kid and put it up on a bulletin board so we can have their picture and their name so that the rest of us can learn the names of our kids. So that there's not a kid that walks in this door who doesn't hear their name 6, 7, 8 times from a variety of adults. Your name is your most favorite word in the English language, isn't it? Hearing your name is a powerful thing. And let's start with our young ones. And then let's latch on to people like Angie and Matt over here, and they're young professionals figuring out how to make it in life, and to have a community behind them that are saying, hey, how's it going at your work? Hey, what's going on in your life? We're supporting you. We encourage you. It means the world to people like them, people like me. And spread it through the rest of our community. This is why we've talked about community groups and being intentional in relationships so that some of the things that are inappropriate maybe to bring up at coffee hour can be shared in those groups so that my deepest pains and the things that define me that are barriers to my growth might be known and I might feel the acceptance of those in my community. We want to grow our church not just larger, but stronger as a group of people. We got to know each other by really being present, paying attention, and listening. So kind of to sum it all up, and the question that's in your bulletin, if you take those home and look at those, is who are you going to practice being a pal to? You can't do it to everybody. We're realistic here, but finding somebody in this church, finding somebody in your family, and being intentional about being present with them staying in attention with them, and then really listening for who they are, not just the words they're saying. This, friends, is how Jesus loved people, and it transformed them, and it made all the difference. And it'll make the difference for us here and in your lives. If you'll pray with me. Gracious Lord, we thank you for such a practical example of how to love. Thank you for the ways in which your son Jesus was present among us, and how he paid attention, how he listened, and how after he got to know people, that's when he spoke. And God, help us to practice the same discipline with one another so that we might be known and that we might be accepted, that we might know that we're loved. For you love us greatly. In Jesus' name, amen.